Hey, John, I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing good. Let's get right into it. Tell me about yourself and the work that you do.
My name's Drew. I work in a local management entity, which is an expansion of state government here in North Carolina. We do administration of a certain type of benefits. And I have a background in HR. I have a background in diversity, equity, and inclusion projects. And I'm currently a leader in DEI for the company that I work for.
Great to hear it. Great to hear it. A lot of things have changed in the country, in the work environment related to DEI. What are you doing to take care of the people and create environments where people can have some fairness and equity to their workday?
Sure. That's a great question. We have seen a lot of change. I mean, DEI has been under attack for a while now. And the way that has shaken out in the workplace is that we have moved away or rolled back some of our DEI programming. For example, we will not celebrate Pride Month this year. We will not do celebrations around other dimensions of diversity. And we've discontinued some of our employee resource groups that were based on dimensions of diversity. That doesn't really answer your question, though. You asked, what are we doing to support the welfare and well-being of our employees? So we've really focused our energy on health and wellness programs, creating spaces where people can still have a sense of belonging around other categories of life experience. Some examples of that would be we have a group that is based around grieving losses. That's something that everybody can relate to, including the loss of some of our core groups at our organization. And we have invested more time and energy into staff development, which, the hope is in this environment that we can continue to retain our top talent through something that is accessible to everybody and supports the individual as well.
Yeah, retaining top talent is super important. I'm curious, what type of like development, like what's the shift? What's the culture that you're going for with the leadership development?
We want to develop a sense of continuity across leadership, and our organization has gone through a lot of significant change over the past several years. And the result of that change is different styles of leadership in different parts of the organization. I believe it's important to have continuity of leadership, and that leadership needs to exhibit values that are consistent with the organizational culture. So first defining what those values truly are,
Right?
yeah, and then building on those values through skills that exemplify those values.
Okay. Okay. We touched on engagement, right? And trying to keep everyone engaged and consistency is key, right? Um, are these new programs? Are like you just leaning into them, or do you have some kind of that have been successful and and have any evidence kind of to the impact that they're having?
Yeah, I can't say that we have gotten those launched as of yet. But on the topic of engagement, where I've seen engagement go really well at organizations,
Yeah.
we have worked with, or at other organizations, I have worked with external consultants or somebody to support the engagement work. But the process that I've seen that is very effective is to start with listening and really seek input from the employees across all levels of the organization. Unfortunately, leaders have a tendency to think that they know because of where they sit. And sometimes they don't know everything there is to know about the experience of working in an organization. So, really starting with listening and seeking input and guidance from individual contributors, from frontline employees about what makes their work go well and what barriers are they facing. I think an important role at the organization is to remove those barriers and keep people aligned with the work that adds value to or value and fulfillment to them showing up every day. I'm having a hard time answering this question with
No, no, no.
me back. Yeah.
It is it's important stuff. And keeping with that engagement theme, like when employees aren't engaged, right?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of things nowadays that can pull like people away from being engaged at
Sure.
work. Um, like what's lost? Like what happens to the work, the team, the environment when people start to disengage?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people talk about quiet quitting,
Mm,
um, and I believe there is a term that they use in armed forces to describe people that are retired without leave. Um, Meaning that they have stopped doing their work, but they're still drawing a paycheck, right? So
okay. Okay.
there is this idea of quiet quitting is not new, and disengagement in the workplace
Can
shows
you
up.
explain to me what quiet quitting means? I've heard the term, but I'm not sure I really fully understand what it means.
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I describe quiet quitting is people that still show up to work, still meet the bare minimum requirements for their
Ah,
job, but they're not investing their time, energy, passion, or personal value into their work.
okay.
And if we, unfortunately, this is a result of the monetization of human capital. And if we disrupt the humanness of people's engagement in work, then bringing their whole selves to the workplace, then they're only going to do what they need to do to not get noticed. So
For the
this
wrong reasons. For
for
the
the wrong reasons,
yeah.
right? And then when people start quiet quitting, the result is not only are they less productive, but they're not going to invest their time and energy into development in the workplace. They're not going to see themselves as long-term career employees in that workplace. They're probably looking for other work already. And I think the biggest thing that organizations lose when people become disengaged is the willingness or the desire to go above and beyond to support the mission of the workplace, and the willingness or desire to add value to the workplace through their own contributions. Sometimes their own contributions may not look like satisfaction. They may look like disruption or frustration with the work or with the team or with the culture of the workplace. But that is not necessarily a indicator of disengagement. It might be an indicator that that person is passionate about what they believe in and they want to make a difference. So when we lose that human element in the workplace, then you know it it could be that a machine could do their job, right?
Well, yeah, and we're having a lot of that come into the mix too. Staying with this topic though, because I do want to ask you about the impact that AI might have on some of the dynamics at work. But it sounds like there's a shift to develop leaders to really kind of listen, and I assume that's listen to what people actually need. I'm trying to understand what's the personal responsibility for the employee, the person, and what's the responsibility of leadership to create that culture.
I'm going to start with leadership on that. I think the role that leaders play in shaping a workplace around a culture is first around alignment. We talk a lot about top-down leadership, and executive team needs to have buy-in, and we need to have senior leadership buy-in. And yes, we can make a business case for employee engagement, and we can talk about how retention saves the organization money. But more importantly, I think it's important for leaders to see themselves as role models in both their individual interactions and in the macrocosm of the workplace, understanding that they represent the company in everything that they do and the values that the company is meant to exemplify, and that all of the employees that look at those leaders, who watch those leaders, how they interact with people and what they do with their teams, those leaders are being scrutinized by their actions, and they're being held to a standard by the employees of the entire organization that maybe that leader didn't agree to being held to that standard. But whether they agree to it or not, people are watching them, and they are looking to those leaders to exemplify the values of the organization, to be a role model for the culture. And when that doesn't occur, it creates distrust with the employees. It creates distrust in the organization. And employees naturally will ask themselves the question, I signed on with this organization because I believed in it. Now that I've lost trust, or I've seen where the culture doesn't align with my personal values, do I really belong here? Is this really where I want to spend my time and energy?
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, when you lose trust, it does change the dynamic for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And listening to you talk about those points, and coming back to that kind of aim for consistency in leadership, I can really just see how much more important it is to have that consistency.
Yeah.
Have in your work, have you ever run up against a leader who, was on board in their words and actions and kind of the surface level, but like where the rubber meets the road in their interactions or how they lead, where there was a disconnect? And any ways that you would address someone who's like, yeah, I'm on board, but then they're getting feedback against, how that actually is impacting folks?
Sure, sure. I'll give you an example on that, John. I worked in an organization one time that one of our values was productivity, and one of our other values was caring.
Okay.
So we had to resolve how those things might not always meet, right? Because sometimes if we take the time to care, we do it at the sacrifice of some level of productivity. Okay.
That seems like a logical on the surface. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So we were in an operational meeting, and one of our leaders that was in a production-based facility, part of the organization that did drug compounding, so it was a production pharmacy. One of the leaders said, "Well, we can't do this thing because it would be at the sacrifice of our revenue stream." So that leader in the meeting was challenged to say, okay, so if one of our values is productivity, and yes, we know we need to make money, but we also need to care for our patients. There has to be this human element. Bedside manner still matters to people. If we need to take the time to care, then how do we meet those two values simultaneously? And it challenged us to think differently about the way we did business. So pushing those things together, and it's not putting a square peg in a round hole, it's making the two things work simultaneously, really challenged us to think differently about how we did business and how we did operations. Of course, yes, we need the revenue to keep the lights on, but how can we make space for the human element at the same time that we are keeping the lights on?
Yeah, in my experience, I feel like I've come up against some of that as well. Like where it's like we don't have time to do this training. We don't have time to develop these skills. And I think that it's sometimes a combination of like I have no idea how to care on this level for people. Or if I'm, faced with an upset employee who's showing a lot of emotion, I don't want to make it worse, but I certainly don't know what to do. And to figure out what to do seems really like big. So there's this unknown about just how much time something like this takes. And it feels like, hey, productivity, everybody knows that's important and we've got to make money or else there may not be even a company to worry about the culture, right? If we don't keep that going. Do, do you think that it's does that seem like maybe a fair assumption as to why that argument comes up or why it's even thought that these things aren't automatically coexisting as like complementary things?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there are a couple of things you said there that I want to dig into a little bit.
Okay.
And one of them is this idea that training, we don't know how to do it, we don't have the time to do it. Well, I worked in training and organizational development for a number of years. And one of the values that I stood on, one of my personal values is, well, if we don't take the time to train them up front, we're going to have to train them twice and clean up the mess. So we need to take the time. And if you don't have the training program or you don't know how to do it, invest time and energy into that because it will save in the long run, not just in terms of the monetary savings and the opportunity cost that is lost when you have to retrain somebody,
Right.
but also in the confidence of the employees when we set them loose in their work, that they feel confident that they can actually do their job according to the way we do it here at this organization. So there is and unfortunately, I've seen it so many organizations where training is not a priority. until it's a crisis situation. And I just can't say enough that training should be a priority. And again, this goes back to the monetization of value. You know, if it doesn't create money, then we're losing money in it. That's not necessarily true. We can we can't put a monetary value on training itself, but it has long-term effects that add value to the organization. So
Yeah, you hit on something. I was just sitting here thinking, I was wondering, is it looking at short term versus long term? You know,
mhm,
short term, yeah, like we might have to pause and learn a new skill, but in the long term, that engagement, that being fully involved in you know in everything, your creative thinking, your problem solving, your innovation, like when you're disengaged, I don't think you get as much of that. But when you are in it and you're teaming well, those things could really catapult the business ahead, but might not be visible in the near term until you like stretch that out a little bit.
right, absolutely. And another thing that you brought up that
Yeah.
I really love is this idea that a lot of leaders step away from caring because they don't feel confident in that space.
Yeah.
So we had a situation in a workplace that I was in at one point where we were not scoring well in terms of patient experience. And this was a healthcare organization.
Okay.
And we put a focus group together on it and we spent a lot of time brainstorming. And the big thing that we ultimately figured out that was missing is this concept of empathy. And
Okay.
if you're familiar with Brene Brown, she's done a lot of work in this space, okay? And one of the things that really catapulted her career is her research in fields where empathy is really important to success. Nursing, first responders, yeah, I could go on.
Yeah.
Brown presents empathy not as a um, not as something we're born with, but a skill that can be developed. And when we took that approach at the organizational level and we said, okay, how do we develop this skill? How do we teach this skill? How do we practice it, role model it, and see it show up?
Yeah.
It changed everything for us. And unfortunately, a lot of leaders I've seen, at least in my anecdotal experience, become leaders because of a high level of productivity. They're high performers, right? But
Yeah.
soft skills may not have been something they got a lot of exposure to along their career path. So in leadership, I've seen companies benefit from spending time with soft skills like communication, like empathy, like listening, that then evolve into an improved employee experience, which ultimately gives a better customer experience.
Would you add self-awareness to that list of
Of course, yeah.
skills?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's in the EQ category, right? Is I have to be I have to be self-aware first, and then I have to self-manage my behaviors.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In my coaching practice and working with a lot of young leaders, that what you just mentioned is like, you know, you get rewarded for having skills and productivity and hitting your marks, and then you get into the leadership sphere, and it's like, hey, did anybody ever pause and teach you what leadership is? Or do you know how to be a leader? Did you want to be a leader, or were you just climbing like that? And it's so interesting to me that so many people get to a leadership role with never having really thought much about what it is to be a leader, what type of internal work is needed, what are we even trying to create here when it goes beyond that individual contribution type skill focus
Yeah.
that had, you know, brought this leader to the success that ended getting up in there. What about like retention for these programs? When you think through like this, I love the empathy work, and you know, you said getting them to model it and you see it like it, so many training programs seem like a one and done. Like, hey, let's go to this thing and we learn, and it might be really interactive, but then it just fizzles out, or the message is completely lost and it's not seen on the day to day.
Yeah, it's a
How do
great
you,
question.
yeah,
Yeah, you're talking about knowledge retention, right? Knowledge and skill retention over time.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I where I've seen I'll tell you what I've seen go wrong, and I'll tell you what I've seen go right. So
okay,
I think where companies go wrong is this: we're going to train on it, we're going to put the training out there, we're going to put it on our electronic platform, and we're going to hope and pray that everybody gets it.
And hope and pray method.
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't work, right?
Nope.
One thing that we know, especially around adult learning, is a skill has to be practiced and needs to be observed, and it also needs to be retaught from that person. These are like critical components of long-term retention of a skill. So in an environment where I'm teaching a new skill, I'm
Mhm.
going to want to, it might be a role play, it might be a scenario-based situation, but I want to see that person exercise that skill. That's the most important thing. Show me that you can do it. And then I need to give them feedback on how well they performed. That helps with initial retention, right?
Yep.
Then we need long-term retention. So we need to instill or infuse observational, skill-based observations into the performance management platform. So often, performance management I see is based around KPIs or measurable objectives that are numeric and they're objective, right? Objective things make us feel good, especially as leaders. When we're handing out performance ratings, we feel confident that, yes, this number says this. I feel good with this performance rating.
Undeniable evidence of XYZ. Yep.
Right, but it completely removes all of the subjective soft skills from the person's work. And again, humanity is so important, especially in work, in healthcare, in sales, in anything basically that has human interaction involved in it. So I think it's critical that we find a way to measure those soft skills. One of the things that I do is I teach crisis intervention training, or I work as a role player in a crisis intervention training once in a while. And this
Sounds
is
like it could be a dangerous role.
it, it's fun. It's fun. It's working with first responders, and the goal is to help them learn, how to de-escalate a situation so people can be diverted from the justice system if they're in a mental health crisis and into
We
right.
need great work, much needed work.
Very, very, very much so. Yeah. But we have a rubric, right? We have a scoring method to say, de-escalation language, de-escalation body positioning, right? This is especially
Mhm.
important with law enforcement officials. And we have criteria through which we can measure subjective responses to the situation. And I think if we infuse that uh, measurement of soft skills, not only does it support long-term retention of those soft skills and the deployment of those soft skills in the situation where they're needed, we can still have objective performance ratings, even though we're measuring something that doesn't have a data point related to it.
Yeah, that it's elusive and it's nuanced and subjective too, right? I mean, it's like somebody could be, if you take it out of the crisis situation, like of first responders, and you
Mhm.
transplant it into the office, right? I'm just thinking, just agreeing that it's hard to measure, but we need to measure it. And just thinking that how often, like, a situation can happen, a manager could say something with the best of intent, it lands incorrectly, and the impact on that person is negative, and both people see completely different things about qualities about that interaction.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that a little bit
yeah, it's just like
because
I'm just like trying to think, how do you measure that successfully? Is it just a starting point and over time, or yeah, let's hear your thoughts on it.
I think it takes a group to define what it looks
Okay.
like. Let's take something, a simple skill like empathy or compassion,
You say
right?
it's simple. Seems
It's
simple.
it should be simple, right?
It should be.
But it can get really complicated with people. The I think any cognizant person could look at two conversations and say, in this conversation, the person expressed empathy, and in this conversation, they did not. So what did they do, right? Now we have to get down to what was it they did to express empathy in this situation, or what was it that they did that didn't express empathy? I mean, it's 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 not as hard as we make it out to be. You said sometimes it's hard to put your finger on it. Sometimes it's hard to really name it. Um, I think that sometimes we shy away from it because we're scared to name it, right? Or that we're afraid that it might be hard. But if we really dig into it, it's not, I don't think it's as complicated as we sometimes think it is. I think we just need to spend some time on getting honest about what empathy looks like. I'm afraid that sometimes leaders, when you're talking about soft skills in general, and empathy is one of them, compassion's one of them, communication's one of them.
Yeah.
I think sometimes leaders shy away from it because they don't feel confident and competent in that space. So rather than shying away from it and saying, "Oh, we can't measure that. Oh, that's too soft. That's not objective," that should be an indicator or a flag that says, "Well, we have an opportunity here to really name what that is and to lean into not knowing, right? Or to lean into our lack of confidence or our less than competence around that skill and sure it
Yeah.
up, right? To define it, name what the skill is, spend some time working on it. It's vulnerable. That's the thing, is it takes us to a place of
Yeah.
vulnerability, and it requires of us to step out of that comfort zone of I can lead without emotion, right? I can lead in a robotic way where
Mm.
I don't come across as human, therefore I don't have to express humanity to my team. Unfortunately, when we step into that space of vulnerability where we start treating people as human, well, then we have to treat them with humanity too. And that is sometimes creates a fundamental friction with a business model that's based on monetization of value. And when we monetize people, it's very easy to move away from those soft skills. When we move into those soft skills, it's very hard to continue to monetize people.
I hate that the only real word we have for them is soft skills. I feel like these are the essence of leadership skills. This is leadership. Um, uh, if you were to like give a company that's trying to get it right from a culture perspective, and I'm thinking that empathy is going to be in there somewhere. Like, what advice would you
Some form
give
of
them? Like, where would companies like where do people start to get to this culture that we're all shooting for, where everyone can thrive, right? Where everyone has that opportunity to do their best work and be engaged.
Yeah, it's a great question. It really depends on where the company's starting. So sometimes organizations have a rough culture sort of defined around their customers, for example. I would take the healthcare industry, for example. They're going to want positive patient outcomes, right? They're going to want positive patient satisfaction. They're going to want quality of care, right? So there's already some fundamental cultural blocks there to build on. At an organization like one of my favorite stories of developing an organizational culture is Campbell's, right? Campbell's makes soup, right?
Yep.
It's food, it's manufacturing. It doesn't need a lot of culture. Okay, let's be honest. It's they got to get the food right. They got to make sure it's clean. They got to make sure that they meet production standards and volumes. And Campbell's was going through a really hard time with retaining employees at one point. And what they did was they leaned into soup being comfort. So instead of selling food, they started selling this concept of comfort. And it changed everything for them. When they framed it in terms of comfort, they could build a concept of their culture around that. So I think first, it really depends. You've got to assess where the organization is culturally first.
Right. But then when you align to something like that, it sends a message. All I can think of is grilled cheese and tomato soup when you're not feeling good, man. It's like the mental cure all, the mental or the sustenance to feel good for sure.
Yeah, settle down and warm up, right? But I think once you kind of figure out where you're at, you can see where there are gaps and where there are things you can build on. And then the next big thing is to create a framework of the organization around what you wish to achieve, right? If you're in manufacturing, that's going to give you a framework that's different than healthcare. If you're in construction, that's going to give you a framework that's different than sales. There is a sales component to construction, but the outcome is very, very different. So you're going to build that culture in a different way. But the next big thing is getting input from your employees.
Right
And I
back
mean,
to listening. Yeah.
yeah, from all levels of the organization, because culture shows up differently for an individual contributor than it does for a middle leadership, than it does for a senior or executive leadership role. And we need all of those people to give input into what that culture means. The next step, I believe, is pretty easy. You need to define values and behaviors. You need to have some framework of culture that is small. It needs to be easy to remember. It needs to be a bite-sized chunk. That would be your values. You may have 3 or 4 values that you can align around, and then maybe 2 or 3 sets of behaviors that align with those values. I've talked about caring and I've talked about empathy a lot. So an example might be, okay, we're going to value caring in the work that we do. One of the behaviors that might show up that supports that value is to express empathy in interactions. That is, and that's something, expressing empathy in interactions, that's something you can put on a performance review and say yes or no, this person is aligned with the culture. And you can, again, infuse your performance management system with your culture to show the importance of it and to have a tangible feedback to the employee about how they support the culture.
I like it. Some power stuff. If we could get all managers to just do that, like be genuinely curious and empathetic about the experience and the motivations of their employees, we'd be in a much better spot.
It could change the world.
It really, really could. Hey, Dru, I really enjoyed talking to you today and sharing your thoughts on how we can make workplaces better for everyone in this rapidly and unpredictable changing environment. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
John, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.